Okay, so this idea of the West that we raised last time again is going to come up. I do want you to continue to think about the West as an idea because it's such a powerful idea. It's always been a real place, but even the real place is impacted by the idea. Right? What counts as West changes over time. At one point, the West was Chicago. Right? Now, Chicago's East. Right? So it's interesting how it can kind of move almost like a wave, and how we imagine it is going to be particularly important. I'm going to argue that the West itself is constantly a motivator for us, and it's going to cause perhaps both positive and negative developments in our history. After the Louisiana Purchase that we discussed previously, after 1803, the U.S. will continue to look for additional lands to settle, especially as the population grows and ideas about spreading throughout the nation continue to grow with it. Most of Florida and southwestern Louisiana is acquired from Spain in 1819, and then we really turn our attention west, right? Once you kind of consolidate east, we can kind of focus our attention on the west. And this, in many ways, holds the greatest attraction for settlers. I think about the whole go west, young man kind of idea. During the 1820s, right, as early as the 1820s, Americans began to move to Texas. Which was then a part of a newly independent Mexico. Now, wait a second. Are you telling me that Americans were immigrating to another country for a better life and economic opportunities? We thought that only went one direction, right? No. People, this is a universal idea. You want to improve your life. So it's interesting that in the 1820s, the move might be in a different direction. Right? I'm not going to get political on you. We ain't got time for that. Think about imagined community. You have Americans leaving the U.S. Does that mean they're not going to consider themselves Americans anymore? No. They're going to consider themselves Americans just living across a border. Now, this is going to be complicated, as we'll see in the history of Texas. Mexico wanted people to settle Texas, right? Because they can increase the population there. It can actually aid the development of Texas. How do we know they wanted people? Because the Mexican government is offering an incentive to get Americans to move to Texas. What do you think they might offer that might bring people to Texas? There you go. In the same way that the colonies will offer land, right, the Mexican government offers large tracts of fertile and inexpensive land to whites who are willing to move there. And it's going to work, of course, because land is always a great incentive, especially for an agricultural society. However, problems will start to develop, right? Disagreements will start to develop between the Mexican government and many white settlers in Texas. Now, there are at least three problems, or at least three problems that are going to start to emerge. Problem number one, Mexico had outlawed slavery. So what happens when all these folks from Alabama, surrounding states, go across the border with their slaves to set up and plant cotton especially, which also wears out the soil in the same way tobacco does? Texas is going to be fantastic for growing cotton. What happens when they come with their slaves and expect to set up shop here, and they're told, we don't have slavery here? There's going to be an issue, right? There's going to be an issue. Well, they try to find a way around this, right? Technically, the settlers in Texas are allowed to keep their slaves as lifelong indentured servants. But most settlers that own slaves are going to be reluctant to give up full ownership rights, right? Property rights are significant to Americans, as we know, especially in this period coming out of the Revolution, in which case, we really pay attention to ownership and property and independence. So the slavery issue is going to be an issue. That's number one. Number two, Mexico is a Catholic country. So what happens when all these Protestant Americans go to Mexico and they are told that, okay, you can come here, but in order to do so, you need to convert to Catholicism. And we hear all these, I'm not going to start. They're supposed to convert to Catholicism. I don't know if they asked them to learn Spanish. Most American settlers were Protestant, so this is going to be an important thing. Think about how important your religious views are to you. yes, you did choose to go there, but does that mean that you would abandon what what you felt like you were before? Does that mean that you leave that part of your culture? That's going to be a choice that folks will have to consider. Well, what do? Most of them convert in name only. So when the government officials are there, oh yeah, I'm Catholic. They do all the sacraments or whatever, and then okay, they're gone. Get out of here, right? It's what do I got to do for the land? Is basically what it was. Last but not least, number 3, Mexico required that the settlers in Texas paid duties or a type of tax on goods that were imported from the United States. And Mexico's like, look, you're bringing goods from another country, you got to pay taxes. The tax issue is a sticky issue for Americans, right? We'll fight a revolution over taxes. So this is not going to go over well. Especially, let's say that the U.S. is right over there, right? Say 10 miles this way is the border. You moved here, but you can still almost see your cousin's house, right? Your cousin's like, hey, I got some oranges here. I'm going. You want to trade them? Oh yeah, bring them over. Government official pops up. Hey, you got to pay taxes on it. What? It's right there, and that's my cousin. I'm not paying taxes, right? You can see why this might be annoying to some, and it might feel like a violation, but technically they're in another country. They have left one imagined community and settled in another. So I think this does raise interesting questions about the notion of imagined community. Right? So what are Americans going to do? They're going to continue to smuggle in goods, as we always have, right? By 1835, tensions between white settlers in Texas and the Mexican government will reach a boiling point. Right? In 1836, settlers will vote to declare independence from Mexico. They will name Sam Houston as president. Houston, Texas. After less than 2 months of fighting, forces the Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to sign a treaty recognizing Texas as an independent republic. So for about 9 or 10 years, Texas is not part of Mexico. It's not part of the U.S. It's its own independent republic. It's a Lone Star state, right? The independent republic. They actually want to be annexed by the United States. That was their goal. But that doesn't happen for a while. So for a time there, I think we need this concept of a magic community, right? They're not a part of this community technically. They're not a part of this one. Technically, they're their own thing. But that can't last forever, perhaps, right? That can't last forever. And Texans really didn't want it to last forever. They wanted to be annexed by the U.S. They still felt culturally American. They're hoping that as settlers, they're moving ahead of their government, but that their government is eventually going to catch up, right, and kind of swallow them back up, I guess. How do we know? Well, the new government sent representatives to meet with President Andrew Jackson to ask him to annex them. But Jackson and others are going to be reluctant at this point to annex Texas. In part, they want to avoid full-scale war with Mexico. But there also is another issue. Texas is threatening to come in as a slave territory. So all of those northern abolitionists, those radical abolitionists we just discussed that are making vocal arguments about not another slave, not another step, right? We should not extend slavery. They're like, oh, heck no, we don't want Texas. There are going to be a number of arguments against annexing Texas early on. Some of them are made by abolitionists because they don't want to tip that delicate balance we discussed previously. Some people would argue using racist arguments. Some argue, nah, we don't want Texas. It's full of a bunch of Mexicans. We don't want Texas. It's Catholic. They can't be assimilated into this country. So there'd be a number of arguments made about why we initially did not want Texas, but eventually folks are going to change their mind on that. Texas is big. It's a lot. There's a lot going on. So eventually that issue will change. But it's interesting that it takes a while for that to happen. So again, those anti-slavery forces in the North are resistant to annexing Texas at this point, since admission of Texas to the Union would tip the delicate balance of power between slave and non-slave states. So Jackson doesn't do it. Jackson's vice president, who will succeed him, a guy named Martin Van Buren, becomes president in 1837. But Martin Van Buren initially is kind of occupied with issues at home. Part of the issue is a panic, an economic panic that had been brought on, many think, by Andrew Jackson killing the Bank of the United States. Right? Remember, he kills the banks. Some argue that this caused essentially a depression. So Martin Van Buren initially is kind of concerned with things here, has to deal with some issues at home, and so it's going to be 9 years before the Texas issue kind of comes up again, and it remains an independent republic for that time. Now, there's some other things happening. That Texas is not the only sort of area in the West, as we saw in the video yesterday, right? Folks are on the move. Other factors will propel American territorial expansion. During the early 1840s, several thousand Americans migrated to the northwest coast along the Oregon and California trails. Right, so we saw all those folks in those wagon trains. They know that they are leaving the U.S., and they know that they are moving into territory either controlled by Britain or Mexico. Their hope is that they're going to get out in front, they're going to set up their homesteads, and then eventually the government will catch up. And then they're in a great position. Right? Most of them are not trying to necessarily run away from the U.S. They're out ahead. They're looking for these opportunities. Now, again, they know that they're in British or Mexican territory, but like the Texans, they hoped they would eventually be annexed. Now, there is one migrant group that isn't really seeking annexation. Right? There is one migrant group moving in that direction that isn't seeking annexation, and that group would be the Mormons. The Mormons had settled in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1846 after facing persecution further east in Illinois, for instance, in Missouri. They're going to be heavily persecuted for their religious beliefs and cultural practices. Several of their leaders are killed right, in this process. People did not like the cultural practice of polygamy. They also did not like the fact that many of them were cooperative farmers, right, rather than kind of individual farmers. And so Mormons see violence in several different locations. Again, although at the time Utah was a part of Mexico, the Mormons were able to really sort of establish their own community. Right? They initially called it the state of Deseret, more or less free from Mexican interference. So they just wanted to set up their own spot where they could feel safe and do what they wanted to do. But during the 1840s, calls for the annexation of Texas and the acquisition of additional territories of Mexico, including California, Utah, become louder and louder. Right? Something is changing. Right? Something is changing. I told you that term or that concept, manifest destiny, is coined in this period, right? Really in relation to Texas. It's finally coined in 1845, so right in the midst of some of these debates. Expansionists also want to establish American control over the Oregon country, which was controlled by the British at that time. Some are even arguing we should fight a third war with England if necessary to get that Oregon territory. Why? Because it's our destiny to control all of this territory. So whoever's in the way is in the way. So some are like, look, if Britain wants it again, we can do it again. Right? Round 3. Fortunately, that doesn't have to happen. It's not going to happen. A presidential election of 1844 comes up, and all of these issues of expansion in the West are kind of central to that election. James K. Polk will run for president as a strong supporter of expansion. He comes out in favor of expansion strongly. He and others will subscribe to this idea of manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, we kind of got some working definitions of it yesterday, but basically, manifest destiny, if we look at its kind of 3 foundations, I think can be described pretty easy and pretty quickly. Manifest destiny is the doctrine that it was America's God-given right. It was America's God-given right to extend our boundaries to the Pacific Ocean. And some say even beyond that. We're going to start thinking beyond the oceans in this period as well. So it's a God-given right for us to extend our borders. Now it's kind of interesting because many will argue that it's not only our God-given right to do so, but it's almost our responsibility. Right? Imagine you're in the desert and you got a whole jug of water, right? You feel like it's really good flavored water, and then you see all these people around you that are dehydrated. Right? You're selfish if you don't give them some. Right? So some Americans are like, man, our system of democracy and capitalism is a gift. If we don't share it, it's almost like we're being selfish. It's almost like a civilizing mission, some will argue. But wait, George Washington had said, stay isolated. Don't concern yourself with the rest of the world. Worry about home. So we're, again, seeing this shift in our foreign policy, right, and how we look at the world. And that shift is definitely underway by this point. So Manifest Destiny, the doctrine was America's God's given right to extend its boundaries to the Pacific or even beyond. 3 specific arguments underpin Manifest Destiny. 3 specific arguments underpin it. And this is a term popularized by a guy named John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan was a newspaper editor and Democratic politician from New York. So he's going to actually use the term in August 1845. Nobody notices the first time he uses it. He uses it again in December, and it tips. Right, they read it into the congressional record. A bunch of congressmen start using it, and suddenly it's gone viral. But I think it really captures a spirit that was already in the air. It's a really interesting article he writes. He says in the article that we have our population is growing, so we have to get more land. It's a necessity. He says by 1945, in 100 years, by 1945, there will be 300 million Americans. People at the time are like, come on. Now he's pretty close, right? We got a little over 300 million Americans now. But he said by 1945, he thought we would have that. So we have to kind of overspread, the land in this way. So, again, the first of the 3 arguments underpinning it was that God was on our side, right? God is on the side of American expansion. The second idea, that first one's almost religious, right? It's almost like a mission that you should spread the gospel, essentially. The second was that American expansion meant the spread of democratic institutions. So it's almost a political argument, right? Expansion means spreading democracy abroad. Now, many argue that this continues to impact our foreign policy even in the 21st century, right? That we have a right and a responsibility to spread democracy around the world, even whether that means the Middle East or whatever. But then some will say, what if people didn't ask us to come? Right? That may raise problems for us as well. So there's still an ongoing debate about this. So, number 1, religion. Number 2, politics, right? To spread democratic institutions. Number 3 is almost more of an economic argument. It's almost economic in a sense. Population growth makes expansion necessary if our economy is going to continue to grow. Right, so number 1, religion. Number 2, politics. Number 3, economics. Think of it that way. And it becomes a very powerful idea, of course. James K. Polk will win. Right? He wins the election in part because he comes out perhaps so strongly for what many of the American people wanted, which is expansion. His first order of business is settling the dispute with Great Britain. Right? He turns his attention initially to Oregon. Thankfully, we do not go to war again with Great Britain. We will instead sign a treaty. Right? In 1846, a treaty is signed that will establish the present-day boundary between the U.S. and Canada. So that line at the top of the country that goes across, it's so neatly written, looks like with a ruler. Well, it was. And it's carved out in 1846. But this is fantastic. Think about this in terms of our conversation of exceptionalism. Right? We will grow the country without having to fight Britain once again. It seems like God is on our side. Right? It seems like we're destined in this sense. So his first order of business is to deal with the Oregon territory, and we will sign this treaty setting up the boundary between the U.S. and Canada. And this paves the way for full annexation of the territory. This actually will calm the fears of many Northerners because now that Oregon is set to eventually become a state, we know it's going to be a free state, right? Because it's north of Missouri. So many people that were concerned about Texas possibly coming in and tipping that balance now are like, okay, well, at least there'll be one slave, one free, right? So maybe this shifts our attention in a way back to the Texas question even more quickly than it otherwise would have. With the dispute settled, we turn our attention then to Mexico. Congress will formally vote to annex Texas in 1845. Formally vote to annex Texas in 1845, and the country will prepare for a full-scale war with Mexico. The Mexican-American War will begin kind of completely by 1846, and it lasts a little more than 2 years. It goes very well for the Americans, right? It goes very well for the American side. sort of repel Mexico, but they would invade Mexico, right, all the way to Mexico City, and force a treaty. Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, Mexico will cede to the United States a massive amount of land, most of its Southwest and Pacific territories. Including what is now California, Utah, Nevada, and most of New Mexico and Arizona, all except a little kind of sliver of New Mexico and Arizona. So 1848, we'll get this massive land, including our great state of California. Right? Think about how this seems like American exceptionalism. God has dropped this windfall in our laps, right, in 1848. What also happens in 1848? Gold is discovered in California. Once again, God is like, here you go. Here's a lottery ticket. You found an old pair of pants? Here's a lottery ticket in it. You win. It just seems like things keep happening. And of course, this is going to propel more and more people west, which then means California can apply for statehood pretty quickly. We come up for statehood in 1850, only 2 years after acquiring the state, the territory. This war with Mexico will nearly complete U.S. expansion on the North American continent. Right? There are a few other things. The Gadsden Purchase in 1853 completes the acquisition of the southern tip of New Mexico and Arizona, so we buy that little sliver that we hadn't got from the war. Alaska will be purchased from Russia in 1867, so shortly after the Civil War. But now, once this expansion seems complete, we're going to turn inward and start focusing on our domestic issues. That can be a good thing, but it might also be a bad thing. Right? How are North and South now going to resolve the fact that we have all this new territory that sooner or later is going to apply for statehood? Are they going to apply as slave states, or are they going to apply as free states? And these questions are going to have to be answered, and we'll see how they're answered coming up. Last but not least, in addition to gaining territory, we're also gaining people. Right? This issue of immigration obviously is an important one in our history, and it's incredibly complicated in certain ways. In this period, it's complicated by region and other factors. Right? In the East, Irish immigrants are coming in massive numbers. Between 1845 and 1854, so a 9-year period, 1.5 million Irish immigrants come. 1.5 million Irish immigrants come between 1845 and 1854. Most of them are kind of compelled to leave Ireland because of the potato famine. They're starving, right? So they will seek their fortunes here. Large numbers of Germans also come to the U.S. during this time, as well as smaller populations from Switzerland, Norway, Holland, Sweden, Netherlands. This large influx of Irish immigrants in particular, who tended to be poor and Catholic, will fuel an anti-immigrant sentiment in the U.S. And it gives rise to something called nativism or nativist movements. Right? Nativist movements is kind of a backlash against immigrants. Nativism is simply a prejudice against people not born in one's country. It's a prejudice against people born outside of the U.S. Nativism. Now, it does not mean that often it's defined as a preference for those born in your country. Right? But nativism will not privilege Native Americans, right? So it's interesting. Folks call themselves Native Americans, but they're not talking about Indian Native American. They're talking about native born. You know what I mean? Think about this notion of imagined community, right? And also with the acquisition of California, think about how complicated immigration has always been here in the West. You literally have the border move around people, right, that are already here. They might be in the same house, but suddenly that house is no longer in Mexico, it's in the U.S. In addition, Asian immigration. Right? In the 1850s, you get large numbers of Chinese laborers coming, particularly to California. More than 90% of Asian immigrants will come to the West Coast of California in particular, working in the railroads and gold and elsewhere. And more than 90% of them early on are male. So overwhelming. Think about that skewed gender ratio and how that may contribute to some folks feeling a little nervous about this. But these nativist movements will actually turn into political movements, including a political party. The Know Nothing Party was anti-immigrant. That's literally was their campaign platform. So if we think of nativism historically, we know that it's not necessarily just a 2019 kind of phenomenon. Okay, I know that was a lot, but hopefully it's sort of beginning to tie us up and also get us closer and closer to this discussion of civil war, which obviously is important.